question I'd like to ask today is, can we manage anxiety? Can anxiety be managed? The answer is, well, yes, I suppose so. But it's not very nice for us when we do. It's not exactly an optimal situation. And if we imagine that managing our anxiety makes it any more amenable, or makes it go away, or makes it any less insidious, then we'd be wrong, because it doesn't. We might be able to avert the worst catastrophes. We might be able to not show the anxiety so much, but it certainly doesn't go to make it go away. And in fact, if we manage it, all we're really doing is pushing it underground. And of course, that's not a good idea. Plus, if I may make so bold as to suggest it, there is something very suspicious about a bunch of people who have never had clinical anxiety assuring people who are suffering from clinical anxiety that they know how to deal with it, that it can be managed, it can be successfully managed. If it was me, I would not be entirely convinced on that score. Of course, we could say, as an anxiety management therapist, well, I learned it. I've never had it, and anxiety management therapists do say this. They're very honest and say, look, if they've never experienced clinical anxiety, then they might say, look, I've never experienced it, but etc., and come clean about it that way. But there's something, all the same, there's something very suspicious about this, because how can I tell people how to work with anxiety if I don't really know what it is, but I read about it in a book or heard people talk to me about it? How the hell can I do that? And well, obviously I can do it fairly easily. I can do it as easily as anything, but how do I feel about doing that? Is there not some kind of lack of integrity in this kind of a thing? Because if it so happens that I've never experienced anxiety or depression or psychosis or anything like that, I really, really, really don't have a clue. And no amount of books is going to change that at all, because understanding of that nature doesn't come out of books. And all the people who formulate the theories, when I say theories and the protocols for therapies or whatever, they don't really know. I know they don't know, I can tell. I'm not saying that I do know what the answer for anxiety is, but I do know when someone else doesn't know but is letting on. I do have a sense for that, and I think we all do, if we have had some personal experience of some sort of the topic in question. So, for example, I remember going to an hour-long talk on pain management. That's another good one, of course, given by none other than a pain management specialist. It's great, isn't it, to get one of them to help you? And without meaning to be critical, I just knew on a level, on a kind of gut level or whatever, this guy doesn't know anything about chronic pain. He's never had it. He does not know what it's like to have chronic pain. Now, to a certain extent, I have had experiences of kind of chronic pain for a number of years, quite a few years. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know what the bullshit is when I hear it. And this, what I heard that day, was pure bullshit. I'm not saying the guy knew it was bullshit. In his own mind, I'm sure he felt that he had it sussed. he was, after all, a specialist. So anyway, I won't carry on being sarcastic because it gets a bit wearing. I got some feedback from the last episode, and the feedback was to the effect that it kind of sounded good, or it sounded kind of, it was understandable up to the very end, and at the very end it kind of tailed off. So I was thinking I should try and maybe pick up where I left off and make it instead of just saying it all in just a sentence or two, trying to make it a bit more clear for myself as well as anyone else. So the basic idea is that, well, going back to what I started off by saying about this quotation from Mark Twain, that if we're being anxious, that's a bit silly. Well, that's not actually his quote, but that's a bit silly because we're paying a debt we don't owe. So what are we paying it for? What are we sweating for? That debt isn't due. But it is due. That's the crux of the matter. It totally is due. We've bought whatever it is we bought, and we are in debt, and we have to pay that debt, and there's no two ways about it. So that's the first thing to understand, and we should understand that very well indeed. The debt is due, and it has to be paid. There's no getting out of paying it. Absolutely no getting out of paying it at all. So what have we bought? What are we in debt for? What's behind it all? And what we've actually done is we've arranged things so that instead of being primary and doing being secondary to being, we've flipped it over so that doing is king and being becomes nothing more than a vague promise to be waved in front of our noses every now and again to spur us on with the doing. So that's the inversion. We want it this way round. We want to have doing above being. And actually it eclipses being because there's no real being in this arrangement. There's only the promise of being or the assumption of being, but the real thing isn't there at all, because when being is turned into an adjunct of doing, it's turned into nothing. It's just turned into the idea of being, however that might be expressed. So the next question is, if that, what I just said was a question, maybe it wasn't. But the next question is, well, why do we want to do this? Why do we want to make doing primary? Why do we want to put doing on the throne? What's the point in that? What do we gain from it? We must be doing it for a reason. And the answer is doing, purposeful doing, is inseparable from the doer. So by glorifying doing, we glorify the doer. And the doer is the self-concept, the causal agent, the one who chooses, the one who decides, the one who is in control. The ego, the self. That's why we do it, because we want to shore up the ego or self. We want it to be up there. We want it to be a real thing, a going concern, something to be taken seriously. In other words, we want to have the experience of being this doer, not this beer. We want to be the doer, not the beer. Why not be the beer then, we might say? Being is good. Being is nice. I can be a beer, not a beer, not a Carlsberg or Stella, but a beer. But that doesn't work, unfortunately, because there is no one who does the being. There's just being. Doing, it does have a doer. Doing and the doer go together, because the doing is causally related to the doer. The doer makes the doing happen. The doer is the inevitable inference we make from a doing. Being is totally different. No one does being, as I said in the last installment. It's not the output of a process. It's not the output of some act of control or management. There's no protocol that we turn the handle around creakily and out pops being. That just can't happen. We can't do that. So we can have being, because being's already there, and actually being is what's real. Nothing else is real, just being. So we can have being. But if we do, we cannot have the experience or the perception of being the efficacious causal entity, the ego. We can't have that experience, not if there's being. It takes the glory out of it, out of being the ego. The ego becomes unnecessary. There's nothing to strive for. There's nothing to achieve. There's nothing to be proud of. There's nothing to be worried about. Oh my God, will I achieve with the being? Will I get the being done? Will I be able to be? Look at me, I've managed to be. Because as soon as we say that, it's not about the being. The being is subsidiary to me. It's my being. It reflects my cleverness that I'm able to be. So, from the point of view of the self, there's only one way to arrange things, and that's to have doing primary and being secondary. So if we want to have this particular perception of the self, the one who decides, the one who chooses, the one who is in control, the one who says, the one who does things, gets things done, then we have to arrange things in this particular way. And if we arrange things in this particular way, we have to pay a price for that, because the price of arranging it this way is anxiety, either latent or manifest. There's absolutely no way out of that. So what I'm saying is that to be the self-concept, or the I concept, the me as opposed to the world, is inseparable from anxiety. It never can be separated from anxiety. Anxiety is the price we pay for this orientation. And of course we can have the fantasy that we can be free from anxiety, or that we don't have to have anxiety or depression or anything else, but that's just the hype, that's just the talk. Actually, no. We don't like to face it. We probably, well, we don't want to face it, we won't face it, because we have this fantasy that the ego or the self can be separated from the frustration and suffering that comes from being the ego or self. It's that hope which actually allows the self to carry on. If it didn't have that hope, it would be a bit down. Me, the self, would be going, oh no, I can never be separated from this awful frustration and pain and suffering and sense of futility and meaninglessness and all the rest of that kind of stuff, not good stuff. And then I'll be thinking about that, and I'll be aware of it, and it'll get me down. Then people would come along and say, that lad's depressed. That lad's depressed because his ego has just realized that the ego or self can never be free from the suffering that is attendant upon being an ego or self. So then someone or other would say, well, give that lad some antidepressants, or give him CBT or anything, something. Just give him something, and tell him that, yep, what your insight has shown you isn't true. The self can be free from the evils of meaninglessness, alienation, anxiety, and all the rest of it. Now, of course, we'd never say that, because if we said that, we'd have already said the truth, and we'd listen to ourselves saying the truth, and we'd cop onto it a bit. But we never say that, but we do imply it. So all of that stuff that I just said never gets said, but it's implicit. It's totally implicit. And it's fair to say that no one's going to get very far, which is just a restatement of the Buddha's first truth, which is that conditioned existence is always suffering or frustration, because we're tormented by all these fantasies of good stuff that we can never get, because the fantasies are just that, fantasies, because the conditioned self can't ever relate to what's real without ceasing to exist. So it has to relate to the fantasies of the good stuff. It can't actually connect with it. Just as it can dream about being happy, but if it was happy to cease to exist, because happiness is when we let go of the idea, the concept of the self. Just as peace is when we forget about ourselves. And so the conditioned self can't ever really mean it when it says it wants freedom, wants to be free, or wants to be happy, or wants to be peaceful. It can think that it means it, but it can't actually mean it. Deep down, it doesn't mean it. That's all just talk. So out of that talk comes our therapeutic endeavours, our endeavours to improve self-improvement, our so-called spiritual endeavours, all the technology of spirituality, and all the rest of that crap. But anybody will still say, well, that's okay, that's all very well, but what you said is kind of negative, because what you have just said, what I've just said is that the self can never be happy, the self can never be peaceful, the self can never have freedom, and the price of being a self, the mind-created self, is anxiety that can never ever be gotten rid of, even though it can be repressed from time to time. So that's depressing. That's negative, isn't it? There's no answer to it, because the self can't get rid of the anxiety. So what are we supposed to do? Just put up with it. So I'm just trying to articulate what people would say, I imagine, what people have said. I've definitely heard people come out with arguments like this. This is definitely the type of arguments anybody's going to come out with. So that is true. The self never can be happy, because that's a fantasy. So what do we do when we see that clearly? We either carry on with the denial and carry on believing that the self can attain all these glorious things, or can attain anything at all worthwhile, or we let go of the fantasy. When we see the fantasy to be a fantasy, we let go of it. To see illusion to be illusion is to depart from illusion, as it says in one of the sutras. So if we're willing to see the fantasy to be a fantasy, that's all we need to do. It's a big if, though. It is a very big if. But let's just suppose that we do see it very clearly. And on that very deep level, which we have when we really know things, rather than kid ourselves that we know them, or fool ourselves that we know them, or accept our own deception. So that happens on a superficial level. Belief happens on a superficial level, because under belief is always disbelief. We believe and disbelieve at the same time, because if we didn't disbelieve it, we wouldn't have to force ourselves to believe it. So there's tension in belief. But on the very deep level, when we see there's something much more organic and natural cuts in, where on a very deep level we see something and we know. We don't have to have evidence or proof or research. We know. We absolutely get it, because it's true. That's the power of something when we see something true. If we want to relate to it, we will see that it is true. And when we see that it is true, that will change us. We'll let go of the the idea that we had, the false idea that we had, the fantasy that we had. So when we let go of the fantasy that we had, we stop controlling to make reality adhere to our fantasy, which happens to be the thing we do all of our lives, every day, from when we wake up to when we go to sleep. What are we trying to do? We're struggling to control reality, to conform to our fantasy ideas. That's what we do. It's no wonder the Buddha said that conditioned life is suffering. I mean, does that sound like suffering or what? Does that sound like futility or what? What kind of an existence is that? Spend your entire existence trying to make out that things are what they aren't, and also make out that what things are isn't true. It's a very backwards way of doing things. But when we do see that the fantasy is fantasy, we let go of our controlling. Automatically, we don't have to tell ourselves to, because if we tell ourselves to, when I tell myself to stop controlling, that's me controlling. I'm just controlling double then, I'm doing double controlling. But when I really see it, I stop, I let go. And then the natural order of things reasserts itself. Because things, when you stop interfering, go back to how they are. They always were how they are, but we can muddy the water an awful lot. So when I stop trying to control so as to get reality to conform to my fantasy ideas for it, being becomes primary and doing becomes secondary. That happens all by itself. There's no need to anyone to tell you how to do that, because if they did, they'd be telling you how to control, and that's exactly upside down to what we're talking about here. So when we stop interfering, and that ceasing of the interfering can only happen when we see clearly that the fantasy is a fantasy, then being is on top and doing is secondary. And as I started off by saying, there is no anxiety in that at all. Who's to be anxious and what's to be anxious about?